I'd like to turn things over to Katina Fontes, our education coordinator for the Wayside Inn Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. So tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our featured speaker. And when Sally and I first discussed fall programming, we knew we wanted to do something around the topic of Thanksgiving, an important holiday here at our site, especially Longfellow's Wayside Inn. And those in our audience who have ever made or attempted to make a Thanksgiving reservation can certainly attest to the popularity of the holiday. In our restaurant on that day, it's really difficult to get a reservation. It is a day of food, celebration, and hospitality, so central to our identity. Sally and I also hope to find someone who could speak about Sarah Josepha Hale, the historical figure most responsible for the existence of the modern day Thanksgiving holiday. Sarah Hale, as some of you may know, has an indirect, albeit controversial, connection to the Wayside Inn. As the author of the children's nursery rhyme, Mary's Lamb, which most of us know today from the song Mary Had a Little Lamb, her work became the center of authorship debate in 1876, when some 46 years after it was first published, a woman named Mary Tyler, AKA Mary Sawyer from Sterling, Massachusetts, claimed that portions of the poem were actually written about her by a gentleman named John Rollstone. Mary Sawyer told a story of her pet lamb coming with her to the one-room schoolhouse from the Redstone School, which I kind of had in my background here. She attended as a child, and Rollstone presenting her with a poem written about it. This story caught the attention of Henry Ford, who owned the Wayside Inn in the early 20th century. And he was so moved, he was so inspired by that he moved the schoolhouse to our site in 1927. But most scholars and researchers who have examined this debate will note that Sawyer's claims have little foundation. Rollstone died as a young man and was long gone by 1876. And the slip of paper he supposedly wrote the poem upon and gave to Sawyer were never produced as evidence. And most importantly, and connected to tonight's discussion, by 1830, Sarah Josepha Hale was already an accomplished writer and editor who would go on to publish many more works. Therefore, tonight we are most fortunate to have with us a speaker who has written on both these topics and who can so thoroughly and beautifully bring them together. Melanie Kirkpatrick is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and former deputy editor of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. She is the author of several books, including 2 on tonight's themes. So one is Thanksgiving, the holiday at the heart of the American experience, and lady editor, sorry, my notes here, Sarah Josepha Hale and the Making of the Modern American Woman, and the latter of which was just released this year. So without further ado, Melanie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Katina, and thank you, Sally. It's a pleasure to be at the Wayside Inn Foundation and talking about Thanksgiving and Sarah Josepha Hale. And welcome to all our viewers, which I gather are all around in different places. And I'll look forward to reading the chat later and seeing just where I've been speaking, who I've been speaking to. My talk tonight is going to be about Sarah Josepha Hale's role in making Thanksgiving a national holiday. But when it comes to Q&A, I would be happy to take questions on other topics regarding to Thanksgiving, if you have any. 2 weeks from tomorrow, on November 25th, I am pretty sure I know what you're going to have for dinner. According to Wotton's survey, on the 4th Thursday of November, an astounding 88% of Americans eat turkey. You won't be surprised that those turkey dinners usually include all of the familiar trimmings: stuffing, cranberry sauce, potatoes, and an array of pies. November 25th is, of course, Thanksgiving Day. On every day of the year, Americans have reason to be thankful for the blessings of liberty bestowed on us before we were born. On Thanksgiving Day, we do so with extra ardor. Benjamin Franklin, who called Thanksgiving Day a day of public felicity, a time to express gratitude for the, quote, full enjoyment of liberty, civil and religious. Among our blessings as Americans is Abraham Lincoln, the president who carried us through our greatest national crisis. Lincoln is also the president who inaugurated our shared national holiday of Thanksgiving, the subject of our discussion this evening. Lincoln's decision in 1863 to name a day of national Thanksgiving created the first in the unbroken string of Thanksgivings that continues to this day. Every president since Lincoln has proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving. This year will be number 158. Now, I expect you are scratching your heads and wondering, but what about the Pilgrims and the Indians? Didn't the first Thanksgiving take place in 1621, not 1863? Isn't November 25th, 2021, the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving? The answer is yes, but. We can trace the roots of our modern day holiday to many sources, including the three-day feast in 1621 in what is now Plymouth, Massachusetts. We can go back even farther than 1621. History records days of gratitude called by European explorers in Texas, Florida, Virginia, and Maine, and elsewhere. And of course, the original days of gratitude on our continent were those celebrated by Native Americans. Ronald Reagan was the first president to acknowledge the gratitude traditions of Native Americans when he quoted a lovely Seneca prayer, as you see on the screen. He quoted it in his 1984 Thanksgiving proclamation. There are many threads woven into the history of Thanksgiving. In the early 17th century, the English settlers of New England often proclaimed Thanksgiving days to give thanks to God for specific blessings, such as a rainfall that ended a drought, or other blessings that they were grateful for. By the end of the 17th century, though, Thanksgivings were almost always called for general unspecified blessings, such as is the case today. Another thread in the history of the holiday is the custom of calling Thanksgivings for military victories. In the 17th century, English and Dutch settlers celebrated Thanksgivings in gratitude for victories in skirmishes with Indians. In the 18th century, the Continental Congress called Thanksgivings to mark military successes over the British. President James Madison called Thanksgivings during the War of 1812. But the Thanksgiving celebration that was most similar to Lincoln's 1863 holiday occurred in 1789.
Gallery Weagle.
And declared a Thanksgiving
Who was that?
of the ratification of the Constitution and
Weagle's wife.
establishments of the new American government. It was the first executive order by a president, by the way. During the early years of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, appointed days of Thanksgiving to express gratitude for wartime victories, both South and North. Lincoln, for example, proclaimed a day of Thanksgiving a month after the Battle of Gettysburg, naming August 6th a day of, quote, national Thanksgiving, praise, and prayer. Union victory was in sight, the president wrote. It has pleased the Almighty to give the Army and Navy of the United States victories on land and on the sea so signal and so effective as to furnish reasonable grounds for augmented confidence that the union of these states will be maintained, their constitution preserved, and their peace and prosperity permanently restored. As an aside, I'll mention that The proclamations issued by both Davis and Lincoln were non-sectarian. That is, they were inclusive of Americans of all religions. They made reference to God, but they were not Christianized. By the time Lincoln became president, just about every state had established an annual Thanksgiving celebration. These were local celebrations, not a shared national one as we have today. The date for Thanksgiving Day was set by the individual governors, who sometimes coordinated, but usually did not. The result was that while most states celebrated in November, a few marked the day in September, October, or even early December. There was an amusing saying that if you planned your travel itinerary carefully, you could enjoy a Thanksgiving dinner every week between Election Day and Christmas. 2 months after the North marked Lincoln's appointed day of Thanksgiving for the Union victory at Gettysburg, the president did something surprising. He proclaimed another, much different Thanksgiving Day. This Thanksgiving was not for the purpose of marking a military victory. Rather, it was to acknowledge and give thanks to God for the entire nation's general blessings. In his proclamation, Lincoln cataloged blessings for which all Americans could be grateful: peace with foreign nations, expanding borders, growing population, and farms, mines, and industry that were producing well. Lincoln was reminding Americans, North and South, that the war would eventually end. He was asking them to look beyond the current horrors to a better day, when the country is, quote, permitted to expect continuance of years with large increase of freedom, unquote. It was a profoundly hopeful message, reminding the American people of the nation's capacity for renewal. Lincoln set the date of Thanksgiving Day for the last Thursday of November, following Washington's example, and thereby helping to cement the tradition for holding Thanksgiving celebrations on Thursdays in late November. As you know, the title of my talk this evening is Mr. Lincoln, Mrs. Hale, and Thanksgiving. So let me turn next to the subject of Sarah Josepha Hale, the woman who is the link between Thanksgiving and Lincoln. She is the subject of my latest book, Lady Editor. The story of how Thanksgiving became a national holiday is a classic American saga of how one enterprising, hardworking individual with a good idea can have an impact in an open democratic society. In this case, a penniless young widow and mother from New Hampshire, subject to all the limitations such a station in life obtained in the early 19th century, how she rose to become the editor of the most widely circulated magazine of her era, Godey's Ladies' Book. She used her powerful editorial position to generate grassroots support for her campaign for a national Thanksgiving and to persuade Lincoln to proclaim one. Hale's name won't be found in many books of United States history, nor will it be on standard lists of the country's great editors or trailblazing feminists, though she was both. When her name comes up, it is usually in the context of her role in creating our national Thanksgiving holiday, or as the author of the children's poem, we all know what that is, Mary Had a Little Lamb, which she wrote in 1830. But her accomplishments extend well beyond either of those achievements for which she is best known today. Hale was an author, editor, social reformer, and above all, relentless advocate of women's advancement, especially the right to an education. When she began her editorial career in 1828, half of American women were illiterate. and no institution of higher education admitted women. A partial list of Hale's achievement on behalf of women includes leading the fight for property rights for married women, who at that time were required under the law to hand over control of their money to their husbands. She also campaigned for women to be educated as teachers and allowed to teach in public schools. Back then, women were considered intellectually inferior to men. Hale, however, believed that men and women were equal on an intellectual plane, but did not have equal status when it came to education. If only women could be educated, they could do just about anything a man could do. She also encouraged the establishment of colleges for women, and she urged women to become doctors. She created the first daycare center for small children, and she created the first public playground. She also founded a society dedicated to increasing the wages of working women. She invented the term domestic science as part of her effort to elevate the status of women who worked in the home. As a member of the post-revolution generation, born in 1788, Hale brought a deeply patriotic sensibility to her magazines. Her father was a Revolutionary War veteran, and she had many other relatives who fought in the revolution as well. She believed, however, that even though the 13 former British colonies had won their war for independence, they would not be truly unified until the new nation developed its own cultural identity, one that was distinct from that of its former colonial masters. At Godey's Ladies Book, she set out to publish American authors writing on American themes. These include Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. From the perspective of the 21st century, Hale's approach doesn't seem in the least surprising. Surely Americans want to read about their own country in articles written by their fellow Americans. But this was a radical idea in the 1820s, when magazines typically reprinted articles they had pirated from British and other publications. Hale believed that there was a market for a national women's magazine focused on American culture. And she discovered or advanced the careers of such notable female authors as Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose early writing she published 20-some years before she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the poet Lydia Sigourney, and Frances Hodgson Burnett, author of the classic girls novel, The Secret Garden. Hale's interest in American culture extended not just to literary culture, but also to everyday aspects of American life: food, fashion, manners, health, and running a household. Her work was instrumental in establishing a common American aesthetic. Soon Americans in every part of the expanding nation were quoting the same poetry, cooking the same recipes, and sewing the same fashions. If you plan to put up a Christmas tree next month, or ladies, if you wore a white wedding gown at your wedding, you can thank Hale, who popularized these customs in Godey's Ladies Book in the 1840s. Hale's readers were also devouring her essays and editorials on what it meant to be a woman in America. One of Hale's greatest and most lasting legacies was how she used her magazine to reshape the way Americans thought about women and their roles. From her perch at Godey's Ladies Book, she was the genius presiding over the remarkable advancement in opportunities for American women in the 19th century. Thanksgiving Day, a homegrown holiday, fit into Hale's vision of a magazine focused on Americana. She saw Thanksgiving as a patriotic holiday, along with the 4th of July and Washington's birthday, the only other holidays born of the American experience that were celebrated nationwide. She also saw Thanksgiving, with its emphasis on family reunions at a big meal, as falling into the feminine sphere. Thanksgiving reflected, too, what she saw as the generous spirit of the American people, and she encouraged readers to remember the needy on the holiday. Godey's Ladies book was a powerful platform, and Hale seized every opportunity to encourage the celebration of Thanksgiving in all corners of the country and in countries where Americans gathered abroad. She helped create support for her idea of a national Thanksgiving by publishing fiction and poems set around Thanksgiving Day. She promoted her campaign, too, for publishing traditional recipes for Thanksgiving dinner, such as roast turkey and pumpkin pie. Her vision of a national Thanksgiving wasn't based on a desire to see Americans feast on the same foods on the same day, but she was realistic enough to know that the culinary appeal of Thanksgiving was another selling point for her vision of a shared celebration. Rather, Hale viewed Thanksgiving as exerting a, quote, deep moral influence on America's national character. This theme would recur again and again in her editorials, especially as the country moved towards civil war. She believed a national celebration of Thanksgiving Day would help preserve the Union. Such social rejoicings, she editorialized in 1857, strengthen the bond of union that finds us brothers and sisters in that true sympathy of American patriotism. Even in 1860, as war loomed, she pressed this argument, writing that a national Thanksgiving could help keep the divided country together. Quote, this year, the last Thursday of November falls on the 29th, she wrote. If all the states and territories hold their Thanksgiving on that day, there will be a complete moral and social reunion of the people of America in 1860. Would not this be a good omen for the perpetual political union of the states? At the same time as she was promoting Thanksgiving in the pages of Godey's Ladies book, Hale wrote hundreds of personal letters to presidents, governors, congressmen, and other influential Americans, soliciting their support for a national Thanksgiving. Such was her influence and celebrity that many of her correspondents wrote back. In the 1840s, an outraged governor of Virginia rejected her idea, referring to Thanksgiving as a damned Yankee holiday and complaining that Northern ministers used Thanksgiving as an opportunity to preach against slavery. President Zachary Taylor, Franklin Pierce, Millard Fillmore, and James Buchanan all declined to call a national Thanksgiving on the grounds that the Constitution didn't give the president the authority to do so. That, they argued, was the prerogative of governors. Finally, as we know, Lincoln heeded Hale's call in 1863. The following year, he issued another Thanksgiving proclamation, again naming the last Thursday of November as the date of the national holiday. After Lincoln's death, Hale did not let up on her Thanksgiving campaign. She successfully lobbied Presidents Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, and Rutherford B. Hayes, all of whom followed Lincoln's lead and declared national Thanksgiving days. But there remained a snag. While the overwhelming majority of governors went along with the date that the president named for Thanksgiving Day and issued their own state proclamations conforming to the date the president had appointed, they were under no obligation to do so. The president's proclamation did not have the force of law, outside the District of Columbia and the territories. For that, it would require an act of Congress. In 1941, Congress finally took action, passing a resolution naming the fourth Thursday of November as a national holiday for Thanksgiving. President Franklin Roosevelt signed it into law, and it took effect in 1942, the first Thanksgiving since Americans had entered World War II. It was a dark time in American history. Thanksgiving, now officially a holiday, took on added meaning with thousands of American citizens fighting a desperate war in Europe. In conclusion, I would ask you to ponder a line from Lincoln's beautiful 1863 proclamation. The 16th president's words remain pertinent today when our country is again fragmented and politically and culturally. Quote, "It has seemed to me fit and proper," Lincoln wrote, "that our nation's blessings should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and one voice by the whole American Republic." With one heart and one voice. What a beautiful sentiment. These are words to remember this year on November 25th, as we celebrate our 158th National Thanksgiving Day. Thank you, and let me be the first to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I welcome your questions.
Well, that was wonderful. I'm really looking forward to Thanksgiving now and to talking with my family about all of the new things that I've learned, and what a terrific ending quote as well. So thank you, Melanie, very much. So I'm looking to the chat. I'm looking for your questions. I guess I didn't realize just how much we working women today actually owe our gratitude to her. So that is good. Okay, so let me just check here. Okay, so we do have a question. Oh, I lost it. I want to get it back. The question is, could you say a little bit more about Hale as a working mother?
Thank you for that question. Hale was in her 30s when her husband died suddenly of pneumonia. She lived in the little town of Newport, New Hampshire, by the way. And she had, her husband left her with 4 children under the age of 7 and a 5th on the way. She had, and penniless. The family, her husband had been a lawyer and made a good living, and they lived well in Newport. But like many young couples, they hadn't built up a lot of savings. So she really had to rely on the help of others. In particular, the Freemasons of Newport. Her husband had been a prominent member of the Masons. And they said they'd set her up in a millinery shop that's making hats. Hated it. And so she decided that she would try. She had always done a little bit, had some writing, and her husband had thought that her writing was quite good. So she decided to try to make some money from it. And she started selling her poetry to newspapers. And then she wrote a novel called Northwood, which was an anti-slavery novel. And it caught the attention of critics in Boston. And then it was published in London too, which was a rare occurrence for an American author. All of this called her to the attention of a clergyman in Boston who was starting up a magazine for women. And he invited her to come to Boston and edit it as the founding editor. It was a tough decision for her, but she decided to do so. And a lot of people in Newport thought she was crazy and really disapproved strongly of her taking the job. She had to send her children to live with relatives except for the youngest, the baby, whom she was by then 5 years old, and she took him with her to Boston. Of course, as we know, it turned out well. She was successful, and she worked incredibly hard, not just at the magazine, but in writing for other publications where she could earn more money. In the end, to make a very long story short, she was able to come up with enough money and she was successful enough that all of her children were very well educated. The boys, the oldest boy went to West Point. He was the youngest cadet at age 14. Her two other sons went to Harvard, where they didn't do too badly. One son was number 1 in his class, and the second son was second in his class. The girls also were very well educated. There were no colleges at the time that would accept girls, but they went to Miss Willard's Academy in Troy, New York, which was considered the best seminary for educating young ladies in that day. And then, she kept on. When she might have quit, her kids were all launched. She was making and had made good, fairly good money. She decided to continue working. And for 50 years, she remained editor of Godey's Ladies book. She retired when she was 88 and she was 90 when she died.
My goodness. I'm just going to go in order here. We have a question. Why was turkey the primary dish for Thanksgiving?
Well, that custom certainly went back to the end of the 18th century, and actually maybe even earlier. But Thanksgiving meals were a little different than they are today. There was often an abundance of food and an abundance of meats. There would be a turkey. There would often be a side of beef. In New England, there might be venison. And one feature of the classic New England dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, was a chicken pot pie. And people would make enormous pot pies, and it wasn't considered a real Thanksgiving dinner unless you had a chicken pot pie there. And it's interesting that custom has, I think, followed down into some families. And I've met 2 people in talks that I've given on Thanksgiving who have told me about how their family, in one case, served chicken pie at the Thanksgiving dinner, and in the other case had a family tradition of having chicken pie for dinner the night before Thanksgiving. Turkeys were, to get back to your question, turkeys were a special meal. It's not the sort of thing people ate every day, but they were still affordable, and a lot of it was a very rural society, and so people would grow turkeys and saving the biggest one for Thanksgiving dinner. As the century progressed, the 19th century progressed, I found recipes for other dishes, and I think it was, I can't remember where it was now, but some magazine published a recipe for the classic Thanksgiving dinner, turkey and all the trimmings. But then it also said, if you can't afford a turkey, here's a recipe for beef. And beef back then was very, very cheap, and turkey was a little more expensive.
Interesting. Let's see. So Richard is asking, was Hale personally acquainted and on good terms with some of the writers featured in Godey's?
Oh, yes, indeed. She was a very convivial woman and was quite involved in the society, the life, the arts and letters scene in first Boston and then in Philadelphia, where she moved after Godey's merged with her magazine. And as for the authors she published, she was very familiar with a number of them. She and Lydia Sigourney, the poet from Hartford, Connecticut, became very good friends. She learned about, she reviewed, she reviewed Edgar Allan Poe's first book of poetry, but then she met him through her son because Poe was briefly a cadet at West Point, and her son told her about them. And there's an interesting story there. Poe, as you may know, had a rather tumultuous life. He married a cousin who was much younger than he. And so the cousin, his wife's mother, was his aunt. And Mrs. Hale was very kind to the Poe family. And whenever the aunt would drop by with her basket, Hale would make sure that she left home with a basket full of food. And there were many other writers with whom she socialized as well as published.
Terrific. Okay, we have another question. What eventually happened to her magazine? You mentioned a merger.
Oh, well, after her retirement, the magazine went downhill very quickly. And by the end of it, it had a shifting a number of editors and owners. And it became more trivial, and it didn't have the sort of the literary prominence that it had once had. And by the end of the century, I think it was 1898, it finally closed. And this question that you ask is interesting, because I think the diminishing of the power of the magazine in a way diminished Hale's reputation, even though she wasn't alive anymore, but people associated her with that that magazine, and it affected her reputation as we moved into the 20th century.
Interesting. We have another question too. As editor, how did she handle the issue of slavery versus abolition?
She didn't write about slavery in her magazines. Mr. Godey, the owner, had a strict rule against writing about what they'd say political issues. And that wasn't completely the case, because she would write about political issues or contentious issues when it came to women's opportunities. But slavery, he would not allow anybody to write about. When another editor at Godey's wrote about slavery for another publication, which usually didn't bother him, some of his Southern readers complained, and he fired her. And so Hale did not write about it for Godey's. However, she was she was deeply against slavery, which she thought was immoral. At the same time, she thought that she opposed the war and thought that it would be better not to go to war, but to wait, and slowly slavery would be abolished in some unspecified way. She she supported the colonization movement, what was called the colonization movement. And that was a movement to send freed slaves to Liberia in West Africa. Liberia was in fact a country that was founded by freed American slaves. She wrote a novel about it called Mr. Peyton's Experiments. And Mr. Peyton in the novel was a slave owner, and he wished to free his slaves, but he just didn't want to send them out into the world without any support. And so in the novel, he sent groups of freed slaves to 3 different places, trying to decide what would be the best place for them to settle. One group went to a rural area, another group went to an American city, and a third group went to Canada, which as part of the British Empire did not have slavery. In every case, the freed slaves failed and were very unhappy in the novel. And they met with such discrimination that they were unable to succeed either economically or personally. And this was Hale's view. She thought that Americans would not, white Americans would not accept freed slaves, and that it would be too hard for freed slaves to be successful. And therefore she supported the colonization movement, which I might add was totally impractical. There were, after the war, there were 4 million freed slaves, and there was no way you could get that number of people off to Africa. And of course, it was not a very moral position either. So I think I find it hard to condemn her for that, because given you have to evaluate an historical character in the context of his or her own day. And this was a genuine and well-meaning attitude of hers.
Is that a book that you can find readily, or?
Of Mr. Peyton's experiments?
Right.
Yeah, it's available online.
Interesting.
I don't know if there are any, you could probably get it, print on demand.
Yeah, probably.
And speaking of that, I will add something I didn't put into my remarks about Hale, but she wrote an astonishing 129 books, wrote, edited, or contributed to them, which is, you think of the thousands of words she wrote every month for Godey's ladies book, and then she wrote all this other material on top of it. It's rather astonishing.
Right, the pace.
She was. Yeah, well, she at first, when she kept churning stuff out because she had to make money to pay for the kids' education.
Okay, our next question is, Henry Ford was enamored with Mary Had a Little Lamb, which drove him to buy and move the Little Red property. Do you know if Hale and Ford ever crossed paths?
No, I don't know the year Ford was born, but his interest in Mary Had a Little Lamb developed in the 1920s, I think, and that would have been 50 years after her death, or 40 or 50 years after her death.
Interesting. Well, does anyone else have any other questions? We're at the end of our questions on the chat, but
I should also say, Sally, I should have thought of this before, that she also published Longfellow. So this is Longfellow's Wayside Inn, and mentioned that right up front, and had correspondence with him that I found interesting to read. They were discussing the placement of a Longfellow poem in a book she was editing. And they were both excruciatingly polite to one another. So
very good.
Yeah.
Great. And then another question, did Hale ever remarry?
No, she didn't. And I can speculate on that. But first of all, she had been deeply in love with her husband. And so perhaps that made thinking about a second marriage very difficult for her. But also, and this is my speculation, I don't have documentary evidence of it, but a widow had a great deal of freedom in American society back then. As I mentioned in my prepared remarks, women, when they married, were required to hand over all their property and all their economic rights to their husbands. So for example, if a woman worked or inherited money, her husband decided what to do with it, not she. And Hale wrote a number of short stories and then a book, a novella, about how many women were very hurt by this. Their husbands would, maybe they were drunks in some cases, or they just were profligate. They didn't manage the money well, and women and their children were very damaged by it. So that could be another reason why she chose not to remarry, because she didn't want to give up that freedom.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Are you working on another book, Melanie?
Not yet. I'm doing a lot of promotion for Lady Editor, and writing things for people about that. But I'm in the back of my mind, a couple of ideas are percolating, so we'll see.
Terrific. We'll look forward to your next. But Katina, did you have something you wanted to say?
I just wanted to say thank you so much. I'm so happy that we were able to put this together. Sarah Hale is somebody I've become so curious about because of the Little Red Schoolhouse and just my own little tidbits of research that I've done. So I've really enjoyed the book. So I just want to say, we still have books available. Hard to see it with the background. Both the Lady Editor, and Thanksgiving. And Sally and I were saying we think these are great gifts to take if you're going to someone's house for Thanksgiving as a host or hostess gift. So, great way to just kind of say thank you to whoever's hosting dinner this year.
Well, my Thanksgiving book was actually intended to be a keepsake volume. And the illustrations are very appealing, I think. And then at the back of the book, there is a collection of readings on Thanksgiving Day, and also a section on historic recipes. So it's a nice presentation volume.
I agree. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for joining. Sorry about the little hiccups with the presentation, but it all went really well once we got it going. And I think we all learned a lot today. So yeah, Sally, did you have anything else to say?
No, I just wanted to echo what you said. Thank you so much, Melanie. Thank you to everyone who was here to hear this. And we will eventually get this prepared so that, like I said, if you missed anything before, you can go back and rewatch, tell your friends about it. And certainly if you think you might like the book, let us know, because we've got them in my office.
Right.
Thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to speak to you, and I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
You as well.